We've been tossing around the idea of a best shots list for a while now, but weren't sure we could ever narrow it down to just 10. So instead, we're doing 5. And then 5 more. And then 5 more after that, and so on and so forth. We've got a whole series planned looking at our favorite shots based on their angles, subject relationships, movement, purpose, and today, their size. These are our 5 picks for the best shots of all time, Part 1. First up, we're looking at the close-up, which is a shot you're probably pretty familiar with. But just in case you're not, it's a close shot on someone's face that includes all of their features, but no more than a little bit of their neck and the top of their head, if that. And sure, you can shoot a close-up of all kinds of stuff. In that sense, a close-up is just a closer than normal look at anything. And we'll get back to that kind of close-up in a later list, but for this one, we're looking at shots of people. And in the people sense, the close-up at its most essential focuses us in on human emotion, expressivity, and it does it in an intimate way. It provides us a heightened attention to the details of a character's face and the nuance that comes with it. Looking at a true close-up on screen is an experience that replicates the nearness that's almost always reserved for intimate and romantic interactions. It's reserved for lovers, sometimes quarrelers, and dental hygienists, and that's about it. While a wider close-up can feel like a leaned-in flirtation at a loud bar, a really tight close-up belongs squarely in the realm of serious intimacy. You only ever see someone from this angle pre-smooch or mid-coitus. Because of its extraordinary familiarity, it can have a very powerful effect, especially if used sparingly. Used at their most intimate, some of the best close-ups get us right in there with Guido Anselmi, Sam Spade, and Hannibal Lecter, to an effect that ranges from dashing to terrifying. At their most emotional, they're Nana from Vivre sa vie and Bonacera from The Godfather. And at their most innovative, we have clever reflections connecting the face to something outside the frame, as in 2001: A Space Odyssey, Mishima: A Life in 4 Chapters, and Alien, or breaking up, obscuring, and remixing the face as in Apocalypse Now, Snowpiercer, and The Godfather, rendering the familiar unfamiliar. But for our first pick, there's absolutely nothing as affecting, as classic, essential, and iconic in its use of the close-up as Carl Theodor Dreyer's revolutionary shot in The Passion of Joan of Arc nearly 100 years ago. Here, we find ourselves with Joan of Arc not on the battlefield, but in the clerical court after her capture. She is on trial for heresy, and the cynical French clerics are using any means necessary to get her to recant. But over and over, she doesn't, and she doesn't in the most marvelous, moving close-up we've ever seen. Simple, sparse, but impossibly touching. This one shot is the celluloid equivalent of chopped onions, and as moving as it is today, it was an absolute revelation in its time. Films originally played in single-take scenes, in a wide master shot, more like the experience of theater than cinema as we know it today. Eventually, cuts developed, and the close-up was invented and started to be incorporated into filmmaking storytelling playbook, but it had never yet been used with the power of this one. Dreyer's innovation was not to invent the close-up, but to pair it so effectively with a nuanced and real-looking performance for such empathetic effect. It proved that getting up close with someone who appears genuine was far more effective than further away on someone projecting an emotion. This one shot quite literally changed the face of filmmaking forever and cemented the close-up as cinema's trump card for feelings. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the long shot, or wide shot, or full shot. This was the original frame, the classic view inherited from the theater that we were talking about. Because unlike the close-up, the long shot is not about faces but bodies, not about nuance but about movement and form, about space and physicality. Only the broad strokes of facial emotions are accessible. But where a close-up completely removes what the rest of the body is doing, the long shot includes it, highlights it, relies upon it. And where the close-up almost always limits the visibility of the space, the long shot makes it an important part of its composition. And as in theater, a good director creatively blocks a long shot, arranging their figures in space to illuminate the subtext of the scene. And good actors use their whole bodies to express things their faces no longer can. But it's not just a wider way to say the same things. It's a fundamentally different shot, employed for different reasons. It focuses us less on just one focal point, one person, and more on that person in a context. And it is less about revealing internal machinations, but about external ones. A long, at its most most essential is a shot of a physical relationship, often a spatial relationship between a person and their environment or a person and another person. And in direct contrast to the close-up, it's a wonderful shot for establishing distance, of keeping characters out of the intimate space. Our favorite long shots include those that relate figures to a space like these from The Exorcist, The Searchers, or The Seven Samurai, and those that relate people to each other like these from Manhattan, Harakiri, and The Thin Red Line. Ida has a couple long shots that make incredibly innovative use of the form, but for our second pick, our favorite version has to be in the Vito Corleone flashbacks of the break-in from The Godfather 2. After young Vito Corleone, who you might remember as Marlon Brando from the original Godfather, loses his job, he goes with his neighbor to rob a house, which is what lands us here. And this standoff gives us one of the most dramatically effective long shots we've ever seen. This moment is tension in a bottle, an entire conflict in a single frame. And it's not just that it makes for absolutely poster-worthy imagery. The long shot here is the perfect choice for this moment in the story. Imagine separating this into cuts, separating Clemenza and the officer, and how much less intense that might be. The power is in the fact that these two are on screen relating to each other, connected, and the officer doesn't even know it. The frame contains and heightens the dramatic irony that the police officer doesn't know what he's walking into, and therefore our suspense as to what's going to happen next. Clemenza's body coils with tension, perfectly on display, readying us for the impending conflict, and there's something else. Who's to say we need all this space? That we couldn't do this in a closer shot, tighter, like this? But something is immediately worse. And it seems to us, in the full shot, the frame leaves room for what's going to come next. A standoff once he's through the door, perhaps. Or maybe just a red streak painted across the opposing wall here. With the frame tighter, we wouldn't even be thinking about it. But with this extra room, we've got to wonder, are we going to need it? Halfway between the close-up and the long shot is the medium shot. Neither close enough to show us the closest of intimacies, nor far enough to really go wild with spatial relationships. The middle child. But it has its place too. Like the middle child, the medium shot is a fantastic mediator, a compromise shot. And not a compromise in the sense that it's the jack of all trades and master of none. No, it's a compromise in that it provides you with some access to both intimacy and space. This makes it the perfect shot for connecting the two, comparing or contrasting them, for tying the emotionality to the physicality. At its best, a medium shot can show us how a character feels about their surrounding, either environmental or human. It connects their face and thus their emotions to the things around them. It's a bridging shot between the inner life of the close-up and the outer life of the long shot. In the Mood for Love uses it to suggest a non-intimate distance. Kill Bill and Crouching Tiger use it to combine a character's inner rage to the lethality of their bodies. The Royal Tenenbaums uses it to introduce characters through both their spaces and their person. Gene Dealman innovates by excluding the head. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly by shooting through a noose, Shawshank through a tunnel. However, for our third pick, we're rather partial to a medium shot in Jake LaMotta's final fight with Ray Robinson from Raging Bull.
Come on! What are you standing for?
Robinson, apparently tired, punched with a fare thee well and rocked Jake LaMotta right to the heel.
Come on, Ray.
At a low point in his life, in one of his final fights, LaMotta practically begs for punishment. And just before he gets what he asks for, the film slows. It exhales. It coils itself up quietly, and first we get this medium shot, and then we get this one. And here, everything shifts. The crowd goes quiet, recedes into the darkness, Robinson looms closer, the lighting intensifies, we hold our breath, and then the pot boils over and it explodes. This shot is absolutely terrifying, utterly affecting. We feel a shift come over the film as it comes over the imagery and know that something is coming. And what's particularly awesome about it as a medium shot is that Scorsese engages in that dynamic between person and environment that we've been talking about. He is actively and conspicuously playing with the relationship between them. And he does that with a dolly zoom, which you might be familiar with from Jaws and Vertigo. It involves changing the focal length of the lens by zooming while moving the camera to keep the subject the same scale. The result of moving in while zooming out is that the background changes with respect to the subject. And by doing this in a medium, Scorsese creates a perfect relational shot. We can see Robinson's position, the physicality necessary for fighting, and most of all, his expression. But we can also see the ring around them as it becomes cavernous and vast and hollow and utterly barren. The men are alone out there, swallowed up by the ring, and we can see how they feel about it, or in this case, how they feel in spite of it. All rage and hate and loathing and violence surrounded by an uncaring void. The moment has almost teleported them to their own plane. In a close-up, this shot would lose its context, its intentional sense of distance from the world outside the ring. In a long, we would lose the emotion, the detail of their faces, the powerful and potent, twisted humanity, which is why this is a great example of a medium shot at its best. Before we move on to our next slot, we want to mention a couple shots we're skipping over. The intermediaries, the gradations between close and medium and long. These are the medium close-up and the medium long shot. The medium close-up is approximately a bust, nips up if you will, and the medium long cuts a person somewhere around mid-thigh. And we're going to make a controversial claim without any real evidence to back it up here, but we don't think these shots are really functioning in any essentially different way than the close, wide, or medium. They just move the focus to different elements at different proportions. The medium close is most notable for being a close-up that's holding back, keeping a little in the tanks in reserve for later so that the real close-up can hit like a gut punch in context, which is good. There's a use for that, just not a spot on this list. And the medium long is pretty much a medium shot that, as legend has it, was popularized in the mid-20th century around the time when westerns were at the peak of their popularity, in order to include the hip-holstered guns, especially for duels, which is why it's often referred to as the American shot or the cowboy shot. So if we had to pick a medium long for a slot, we'd pick one of these from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But we don't, so we aren't. So you'll take your honorable mention and like it, Leone. Moving on. For our next actual category, we're looking at the extreme close-ups. They're shots that are so tight they can only fit a feature or two on screen at a time. Where the close-up focused us on nuances as if we were intimately observing a person, an extreme close-up takes it a step further, as if we were observing them clinically. It fractures the human face, breaking it down into component parts we don't even have experience really interacting with. Only your dermatologist should ever get this close, so it's not really something most people have a schema for. Scientific emotional intelligence studies often ask participants to judge emotions based on only a fraction of a face because it's more difficult than judging from the whole hog. So it's doing something very different than the close-up. Instead, the extreme close-ups tend to use a body part not as a natural means of expression, but as a symbol in the imagery, connected to us intellectually, not empathetically. It's not about connecting with an organic performance, it's about the frame, saying something with the information of the shot, as if it were a semantic element in a sentence. A tear is sadness, an eye is watching, a mouth is talking. The close-up is the canvas of the actor, but the extreme close-up is the filmmaker's domain. There are some absolutely incredible examples of this. Eyes in Blade Runner, Suspiria, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. A mouth in The Man Who Wasn't There. A hand in The Gladiator. Feet in The Tree of Life and 12 Years a Slave. The Matrix, Clockers, and Casino all innovate by using reflections to combine the micro with the macro. But for our favorite use of the extreme close-up, we're looking at Psycho, which has some incredible eye photography. However, for this slot, we're more interested in its iconic mouth. Much like Marion Crane, the Psycho shower sequence has been dissected to death. But just in case you're unfamiliar with the context here, Marion has absconded with $40,000 of stolen cash and stopped at the Bates Motel to hole up for the night, where she meets a young Norman Bates, the hotel proprietor, and hears tell of his, let's say, slightly controlling mother, who then does this. And in this incredibly famous sequence, we get this quick second-long shot. That is, we think, the perfect use for an extreme close-up. It is jarring, sudden, incredibly shocking and in your face. It doesn't feel intimate, it feels violent, like an invasion, like an attack. It's too close for comfort, but it's very effective in a short amount of time. In a frenetic span, the extreme close-up quickly and efficiently says everything Hitchcock wants it to. If we were to translate shots into words, this one would say scream, not Marion Crane screams. That's too much for something this close and this short. Just scream. But in context, that's the exact right thing to say. And it's not Janet Leigh, the actress who's saying it. Almost anyone who can scream could have been the mouth for this shot. This is all Hitchcock talking to you, telling you that screaming is happening. Violent, in-your-face screaming. He's doing it close and fast, and the extreme close-up is the way to do it. And finally, pulling all the way back to the other far end of the spectrum, we're finishing off looking at the extreme long shot. Far enough that bodies are individually indistinguishable, faces are inscrutable, the people are tiny, and the scope is grand, which lends itself to the two things the extreme long does best: grandeur and expanse, and smallness and isolation. At its best, an extreme long expresses a character's smallness in the face of the vast world around them. Like the long shot, the extreme long is about a relationship between people and a space, but like the extreme close-up, it uses the human form as shape in a symbolic image, not as an expressive medium. These microscopic and telescopic scales are not human scales. They communicate with symbols or arrangements or mood, not people. It uses people as figurines, symbolic of the person they represent, but way too far off for us to really engage. Some of the best for a sense of epic expanse are these from last year at Marienbad, King Kong, and Days of Heaven, while some of the best for a sense of isolation and loneliness are these like Stalker, North by Northwest, and American Beauty. But for our last slot, we don't think it's very controversial at all for us to pick a David Lean shot, one from Lawrence of Arabia after Lawrence has turned back into the already impassable desert to retrieve a missing man, even though he's told it will mean certain death. Lawrence of Arabia is full of best ever extreme wides, but even in a sequence almost entirely constructed of them, this is maybe the topper. The expansiveness is jaw-dropping, especially before the era of visual effects, to see a human lost in such a vast sea of nothing, and it renders his feat utterly impossible. Here is a speck of a man having conquered such a vast desert. Here he has come back truly from the brink. He might as well have gone to space for all the emptiness that engulfs him, and the effect is thus reversed. Instead of making us feel his smallness as isolating, we see it as overwhelmingly impressive. So when Sharif Ali is moved by his success, we understand why it's such a big deal. Was that Peter O'Toole on the camel in that shot? It's impossible to tell, and irrelevant. It is not his acting or his scene partners that tells the story. We get more from the camels than any of their writers. It is the broad strokes of the movement and the frame itself that communicates a small man that's larger than life, which is why it's such a great extreme long. When choosing a shot scale, it's all about what you opt to include in the frame and what you don't, that directs the viewer's attention and says, this is important, look for meaning here, not here. Because our attention and ability to process information is truly so limited. It's about controlling what we see that tells us what to take away. It's about size, about how big something is compared to something else, and what that says about their relationships to each other and us as the viewer. And it's about proximity, about closeness, taking advantage of our shared visual language of relations, of nearness and farness with people we've interacted with, to create an impression of intimacy or the lack thereof. And these 5 examples and their honorable mentions keep all of this in mind and use these effects to tell the story, and to invite the viewer to feel a certain way about it, which is why they're our picks for some of the best shots of all time. Part 1. So what do you think? Have any other favorite close-ups, wide shots, mediums, or extremes? Have a different feeling about the ones we picked? Next time, we're looking at relational shots. 2 shots, over the shoulders, groups, crowds, and the like. Do you have any favorites of those we can steal so we don't have to do quite so much goddamn research? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more CineFix movie lists.